Hello YouTube, this is Capandball here, your favorite gun champion, beautiful bright Hunglish language. And what I have in my hands today is an iconic arm of the 17th century cavalry. This is the paddle shaft wheel-lock carbine. This used to be the arm of the Western cavalry and the Eastern cavalry as well. On the Western side, it was the harquebusiers, the bandeliers, or the carbines. And on the Eastern side, we had the intermediate cavalry that was halfway between the heavy cavalry and the light cavalry. And they were all armed with carbines. I love that. Let's learn the history of this beautiful firearm together. According to Raimondo Montecuccoli, one of the greatest military theorists of the 17th century, the key element of fighting in the 17th century, in the second half of the 17th century, was already the firearm. In his book titled De la guerra col turco in Ungheria, or in English, about the war against the Turks in Hungary, states the following: "The closer the enemy gets, the denser the storm of the fire should be, until it is far, with cannons. Then when closer, from muskets, then carbines and pistols it should be fired at. Last with spears, pikes and swords, and then with close combat it must be fought." This beauty that you see in my hands was made in Poland by Rafał Ziółko. He's an excellent gunsmith specialized for wheel-lock arms. And it is actually the copy of an original piece. It is not a 100% copy because the original had a caliber of 16mm and this has a 14mm bore, a smooth bore of course, but still the 14mm is a very good carbine caliber. It is absolutely authentic, so we don't lose anything here.
The production of my carbine took nearly a year, but it was well worth the waiting. The original of this piece is displayed in Eric Gabriel's book titled Die Hand- und Faustfeuerwaffen der Habsburgischen Heer. The carbine is dated to the middle of the 17th century. Its total length is 965mm, with the barrel length of 597mm. Its original caliber was 17mm, with a total weight of 2,940 grams. The most accurate way of loading a smoothbore arm is using an undersized round ball with tight-fitting patch. This offered the best muzzle velocities as the patch is sealing the expanding gases of the burning powder, while it also improves accuracy. However, using this method is complicated and slow for military purposes. But as using patches were common from the 16th century, I decided to start the trials with this method. The charge is 1 Fg Swiss powder equaling 1/3 of the weight of the bullet. The powder for priming the pen was usually finer than what was charged in the bore, to have a faster ignition. These finer powders were stored in the priming flask.
So ladies and gentlemen, that's a very decent 40-meter group. I have 4 shots in a group of, let's say, 10 centimeters, which is very, very good from a smoothbore gun. And I have one flyer here, but that was probably me, not the gun. And even if it's smoothbore with the tight patch, it is working perfectly. So the load was 60 grains of 1F Swiss powder and a 0.31mm patch and a 540 round ball. I love it. Let's try it with cartridges. Let's talk about now the firearms armed cavalry of the late 16th and the 17th century. According to 17th century sources, the cavalry of the time was divided into heavy contingent and light contingent. Heavy contingent was the cuirassiers and the lanciers. They were wearing armors, still wearing armors. And the light contingent, they were the harquebusiers, the bandeliers, the carbines, and of course the dragoons.
The lanciers wore full armor, and their main arm was the spear, like in the Middle Ages. They were to rush into the enemy formation with a frontal charge, but interestingly, they were to attack in rows, and use the same kind of caracole technique as the firearms armed soldiers. They were slow to train and expensive soldiers. The cuirassiers were the most common heavy cavalry. They wore three-quarter armor, and they were armed with a pair of pistols and a sword. They first attacked with the pistols, using the countermarch, and just at the end with the sword. The bandelier, arquebusier or carbine were the most common Western light cavalry, often not wearing armor at all. They initiated the fight with their carbines capable of secure hit from even 30-40 meters. They attacked in rows and also used the countermarch to discharge and reload their firearms. The dragoons were the mounted infantry, a new element of the cavalry arm. Armed with muskets and pikes, they rode to the place of action, dismounted, and fought as infantry in close combat formations.
Another element of the light cavalry were the national cavalry, like the Hungarian hussars or the Polish hussars. They were mainly considered as light cavalry, not always.
The national light cavalry was always a multi-purpose element of the cavalry arm. The Hungarian, Polish and Croatian hussars, although lacked the Western discipline, they were very useful against the Turks.
By the middle of the 17th century, the two most important cavalry types were the harquebusiers, bandeliers, carbines, this is one group, and the other were the cuirassiers. We already had dragoons, but they were quite new in the system, while the lanciers, who were keeping the heritage of the knighthood, they were going out of business. We have excellent manuals written by excellent soldiers in this age, Lodovico Melzo, for example, or Giorgio Basta, or Wallhausen, or John Crusoe. They all wrote excellent manuals for making order on the battlefield. They tried to force the cavalry into the same kind of strict, forced infantry tactics that they copied from the ancient Romans. It was working for the infantry, but it was a mission impossible for cavalry. But cavalry needs dynamism. Their strength is the dynamic attack, which was missing from these manuals. All these theorists, they were thinking about the firearmed horse soldier or the infantry, which meant, bless you, they rode close to the enemy, discharged their firearms, and then they rode back to the end of the tactical formation to reload their guns, and they started this over again. This kind of caracole or countermarch was used in the infantry as well. From all of the cavalry types mentioned before, probably the bandelier was most suitable for this kind of fighting.
The bandelier was technically the mounted skirmisher of the Western tactics. The cuirassier had to use his pistol from nearly point-blank range to cause damage to the armored soldiers of the first rows of an infantry formation. The bandelier could do the same from 30-40 meters.
But before we continue, let me thank you for your support, your donation through Patreon, or buying our authentic American Civil War type cartridge boxes, or paper cartridge formers, or our rubber printing plates for arsenal bundles, or our flintlock tools, or powder measure sets, or US Arsenal Stadias, rangefinders. Have to keep the quality of our channel high. Without you, this would be much more difficult. And let me introduce my new dog to you. Her name is Camilla. Hello, Camilla. We saved this poor little dog with my wife and the kids. You can also ask me what is the real purpose of this rounded shaped paddle shaft. Well, I really have to say that I don't exactly know, but I have my view about it. First of all, this carbine looks like an oversized pistol that can be handled single-handedly. So which means that this stock is actually a counterbalance on a pistol, on a long-barreled pistol. Let's try if I can handle this gun single-handedly. What do you say?
The use of paper cartridges spread fast in the second half of the 16th century, and it was the mounted soldiers who first understood its benefits. The wheellock firearm could be carried loaded and cocked, ready for immediate shot, while the paper cartridge allowed a convenient and fast reload. Shooting the carbine single-handed looks strange, but let's not forget that the borderline between a pistol and a short arquebus was very thin at the 16th century. My distance here is only 10 meters, so if the carbine was handled as pistol on horseback, I'm pretty sure that it was only effective on point-blank ranges.
The second purpose of this rounded butt shape is probably making the gun more comfortable when wearing a breastplate like this. It is much more easy to put the stock of the gun under your armpit if it is rounded. But that's only my guess. That's only my guess. Mounted arquebusiers, bandeliers or carbines, they appeared sometime in the second half of the 16th century, and according to contemporary Hungarian sources, they were equipped with a carbine, a pistol, a sword, and they were wearing a pistol-proof breastplate and a backplate also. And they also wore a special type of helmet, an open lobster tail helmet that we call in Hungary the hussar helmet. And ladies and gentlemen, I actually have a repro hussar helmet here. Just check it. This is when design meets practice. So it is an open helmet, which means it is offering a very good visibility. It has a lobster tail here that is protecting the back of the neck. And it has ear protection as well. These flip-flops are protecting the ear very well. It also has an iron piece that can be withdrawn to protect the nose. This type of helmet is offering a very good protection for the soldier. It has Eastern origins, but it spread very fast in the 16th, 17th century in Europe. So technically it was used all over the European continent. So what or who are the carbines? First of all, the carbine term reflects to a soldier, type of soldier, and also this little firearm that I have in my hands. The carbine, as a soldier, was very close to the arquebusier, but the firearm that they used had a bit smaller caliber. They were also wearing a helmet, they also had a breastplate, a backplate, they had a pair of pistols, they had a hanger, they had the equipment for loading the gun like the priming flask, but the caliber of their gun was usually a bit smaller. Both the carbines and the arquebusiers wore the guns on their right side, hanging usually on a bandelier. That was a stripe of leather. Their principal arm was the carbine. These carbines were never longer than 120 centimeters. Their caliber was between 13 to 18 millimeters. The weight between 2 to 3 kilograms, so it was really light. And they were usually equipped with a wheel lock or an early flintlock that we call the snap hand lock. Carbines were not invented for military purposes. In fact, hunting from horseback was very popular also in the 15th or 16th century. And this kind of hunting needed a firearm or long-range arm that was easily dischargeable, which means that when you spot the game, you can immediately fire. The matchlock was not suiting for this kind of purpose. The V-lock was the first type of ignition that really gave the benefit of immediately firing when we see the game. So this kind of ignition system in the early 16th century offered a good solution for the military as well, offered a good solution for the hunter, the law enforcement, and also for the bad guys as well. Let's see now how the carbines were loaded. The horse soldier had to be able to reload his gun on horseback, which means that the same kind of loading method that the infantry was using, like using these wooden containers on the bandelier, what we call today the apostols, was just impossible. It was not convenient, so they needed a different approach. They had two options for this. The first option was to reload the gun using the powder flask with loose powder and a loose ball. The second option was making cartridges, and the bandeliers usually made cartridges, and they were storing these cartridges in the cartridge box or in a little pouch on their sides. So let's roll out some paper cartridges according to a pattern that was described by John Crusoe in his book published in 1632.
John Crusoe's procedure is interestingly exactly the opposite approach than compared to later cartridge rolling methods. Let's follow his original words. Having molded the paper, one end of it is to be turned in to keep in the powder, and the due charge of powder to be put into it. At the other end, which powder is to be closed in by tying a little thread about the paper. Then the bullet is to be put in, and that also tied in with a little thread. Carbines and pistols were also loaded with loose powder and ball, but using pre-rolled paper cartridges was a much better option when riding. The carbine carried a dozen of these into battle in his cartridge pouch. The powder charge here is the same 60 grains of 1F Swiss powder. The seal of the powders is good as well, as the ball is inserted in the muzzle with the paper envelope that is acting as a webbing.
And ladies and gentlemen, this is the group at 40 meters with the paper cartridge. The same powder charge, the same ball, the 540 ball in the same bore. And I really have to say that it is good. It is absolutely not bad. Probably it is even better than with the tight-fitting patch round ball, which means that from the technical point of view, you just don't have to waste your time with using a tight-fitting, hard-to-load patch bullet, but you can also use the paper cartridges with the same effectiveness. From the technical point of view, it is the same. Let's talk about now the tactics of the Western type bandeliers, arquebusiers and carbines. The principal tactical formation of the 17th century for the cavalry was the square, the even-sided square according to John Crusoe, Basta, Lodovico Melzo and Wallhausen. Which means that if I had a company of 64 bandeliers or arquebusiers, they were forming a square of 8 by 8 horsemen. There were less deep formations as well, like with 5 or 6 ranks, but their use was not as common as in the case of the even-sided square. If the front of the enemy unit was wider, then the cavalry unit could be widened as well. This was called the doubling, which means that instead of using 8 by 8 soldiers in the square, they used 4 by 16 or 2 by 32 soldiers, which resulted that more and more soldiers were able to discharge their guns towards the enemy. They were using the countermarch technique, which means that if they discharged their firearms, they wheeled to the left and returned to the back of the tactical formation and started the reloading process. Selecting the right direction for the attack was very, very important, as firing to the right with a carbine is quite difficult. But if you're firing to the left, then you can support the gun on your left hand holding the bridle, which gives a much stable position for the gun.
A good example of this is displayed in Wallhausen's manual. It is clearly visible that the bandeliers are aiming in the left direction while carrying out the caracol.
But let's not forget that this kind of tactics was just a forced interpretation of the old ancient Roman tactics, and the order that Melzo, Basta, Wallhausen and Kruse were looking for on the battlefield probably did never exist. All in all, the cavalry by these times could be deployed in two types. The first one is united in one body, the second one is separated into companies. When it was divided, it should be divided in two even companies, and these companies must be placed on the right and the left flank of the formation. According to Wallhausen, there were basic tactical formations that the cavalry could use by these times, using these squares as the little cells forming larger formations, and these were the lunar, the checker, the broad-fronted, the embowed, the sharp-edged, and the divided. The reform of these complicated Western tactics already started during the 30 Years' War. Gustavus Adolphus II, the King of Sweden, lightened his soldiers. He only had one cuirassier regiment because they were expensive, and all his other cavalry troops were much lighter and much cheaper, of course. The armor of this lighter cavalry got lighter as well. Only the breastplate, the cuirass, and the backplate remained. They were armed with a pair of pistols, a sword, and nothing more, no carbines. And you know why? Not because it was not useful, but because Sweden lacked the finances to equip them with carbines. And instead of using the tactics that were based on using the slow maneuver squares, he placed the cavalry on the flanks, and they used them in dynamic charges. And this was much closer to the original role of the cavalry. And this was probably the first sample for the intermediate cavalry that was mainly introduced not because tactical point of view, but because of the lack of finances to make better Western-type horse soldiers.
Let's shoot the cartridges from offhand now. Let's not forget that this use is still very far from the accuracy of shooting on horseback, and the range circumstances are also very far from the actual fight.
Let's check it. And this is the group at 40 meters shot offhand with the same paper cartridges I was using from the bench. And I really have to say that it is good, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a great fun to shoot this little paddle shaft carbine. And it is accurate. It is accurate with the paper cartridge as well, which means from a tactical point of view, it could do what it was designed for. I was aiming at the center bottom of the black area, the aiming mark, which means that the shots are, let's say, 25 centimeter high. But this is not a problem because these sights were actually designed to shoot like this. You were actually aiming at the most probable part of the most visible part of the target, the center of the body, which means somewhere in the belly, to have the shot somewhere in the upper body or the chest. So this is good like this. It is fun.
Let's talk a bit about the training of these soldiers. Training was just as necessary and important as today. First, the soldier had to master his arm. He had to become a formidable weapon himself. And then he had to learn how to fight in the unit as well. For this, you needed a very strong discipline. According to Vegetius, the most important task of the training was to train the soldier to never ever leave the formation. The horses were also trained. They were drilled with the sound of pistols, carbines, muskets, cannons, trumpets, drums, to withstand the strange and strong noises of the battlefield. Now let's talk about the Eastern European intermediate cavalry that appeared in the second half of the 17th century. In the 17th century, during the long war against the Turks in Eastern Europe, a new horseman type appeared as well. It was merging all the key benefits of the Western European cavalry types, and also it was equipped with the knowledge and with the tactics and with the flexibility of the light horsemen of Eastern Europe. Miklos Zrínyi, or Nicholas Zrinski, the Croatian-Hungarian war hero, was also a theorist. He was fighting the Turks in this Eastern European theater of war, and he was very, very successful against them. He also mentioned this kind of intermediate horseman in his book titled Tábori kis trakta, which was written just in the middle of the century. He mentioned only one single horseman type, a transition of the cuirassier and the bandelier or harquebusier. He was wearing only a breastplate, an open helmet, like the one we have here, a pistol, a carbine, a sword, and nothing more. He said that the lance is absolutely useless, and this soldier, this horseman, is appropriate for all the jobs that can be encountered on the battlefield and outside the battlefield. Raimondo Montecuccoli, the great theorist, also described this kind of intermediate horseman as the most important horseman of the second half of the 17th century. He said that this horseman must wear a half armor with a breastplate that is musket ball proof, also a backplate. He must also wear an open helmet that is protecting the ears and the neck as well, like this lobster tail helmet, the hussar helmet we have here. The soldier must be equipped with a pair of pistols and the swords, and the first throws they must receive carbines. He was especially against using large numbers of the old bandeliers and harquebusiers because they were not properly armored. He also stated that when they are using the caracol technique for reloading the guns, then they are moving back. This can also be easily mistaken as a retreat, which means that they can pull back other troops with them as well, which is quite dangerous. So this intermediate cavalry was a good choice for the theorists and to the practical military men as well. But as the Turks always had a large body of light horsemen in the theater of war, it was still necessary to have light horsemen in the army. But according to Raimondo Montecuccoli, they had limited use. They were not really useful on the battlefield, but they were useful outside the battlefield for reconnaissance, for harassing the enemy, for fighting the small war, for catching a tongue. But on the battlefield, they were only to be used for chasing the enemy after it was broken. But if the enemy is turning back on them, it was much better for them to flee. A common type of projectile we find on 17th century battlefields in Hungary are the slugs hammered from musket balls to be able to load them into smaller caliber firearms like the carbines and pistols. These projectiles were used due to the inferior military logistics on the borderline between the Ottoman Empire and the Christian territories. But from close range, they were deadly. Let's see now how they perform at 25 meters distance.
Hey ladies and gentlemen, that's the hammered slug made from a musket ball by hammering, and as you can see it is very inaccurate. I have beautiful keyholes here. None of the bullets was hitting just in the direction of the axis of the bore, which means that that you cannot really hit anything with this at larger distances. This is only 25 meters, ladies and gentlemen, and still at 25 meters I was not able to hit the 40 centimeter black area of the musket target. But from close range, I'm pretty sure that it was very, very deadly. So the revolution of the cavalry started with the wheellock and the flintlock carbine and pistol, ladies and gentlemen. These arms were the first ones that offered formidable firepower to the cavalry against the infantry, finally. And in the later centuries, the horsemen, the well-trained horsemen, made a good use of the longer shooting range, longer firing range of the carbines compared to the pistols. So ladies and gentlemen, I really hope that you enjoy this little 17th century time travel again. If you like what I do, then please comment, share, like and subscribe. This will help the channel to grow. Until next time, stay cool and keep your powder dry.